When the world tipped into war in the late 1930s, most Americans did not want to be pulled into another European conflict. The Great War, the war to end all wars, was still fresh in living memory. Families had buried sons, veterans had returned with scars, and the price of intervention had engraved itself on the national psyche. Isolationism was not merely a policy in Washington. It sat in living rooms across the country. People in small towns and big cities alike worried about jobs, family budgets, and local community life, not foreign entanglements. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was acutely aware of the danger posed by the Axis powers, but he also understood the limits of public appetite for war. So the administration walked a careful line: aid without combat. That line became a lifeline for embattled democracies. The Lend-Lease program, signed into law on March 11, 1941, authorized the United States to supply food, ships, aircraft, tanks, and industrial material to allies whose defense was deemed vital to American security. Lend-Lease was the major bridge between neutrality and full combat. It kept Britain in the fight, helped the Soviet Union survive the first terrible years of the German invasion, and allowed American industry to rehearse the mass production that would define the war years. Still, the United States remained essentially at peace. The nation's focus was domestic: recovery from the Depression, building jobs, and stabilizing communities. Congress passed a peacetime draft, the Selective Training and Service Act, on September 16, 1940. The country began training men for the possibility of future action, but sending millions overseas was an idea that the public had not yet embraced. That posture changed in an instant on the morning of December 7, 1941. The day that changed everything. Pearl Harbor was more than a military attack. It was a rupture in the national imagination. Shortly after dawn on that Sunday, waves of Japanese aircraft struck American warships and airfields at Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu, Hawaii. Battleships lay burning. Battleship Row was a chain of oil and fire. More than 2,400 American servicemen and civilians were killed. Aircraft were shredded on the ground. The photographs that reached mainland newspapers the next day, columns of smoke, listing hulls, sailors in the water, were images the nation could not ignore. Public anger and shock flowed quickly into resolve. The very next day, on December 8, 1941, Congress declared war on Japan. The vote in both the House and the Senate was nearly unanimous. Within days, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States on December 11, 1941, and the United States reciprocated. A country that had long argued about isolation and intervention now pivoted almost overnight to full commitment. The immediate reaction was at once emotional and practical. Americans mourned and then organized. Men and women volunteered by the tens of thousands. Recruitment stations filled with young men offering their names. The images of Pearl Harbor created a new kind of national narrative. This was not a distant war. It was an attack on American soil and American lives. The rhetoric that followed was direct, moral, and mobilizing. This was a fight for survival and for the defense of liberty. And the mobilization that followed was total. The United States moved to convert an economy built for peace into an economy for war. A process that required speed, scale, and coordination unlike anything the country had seen before. President Roosevelt had called the United States the arsenal of democracy before American troops went into battle in large numbers. Once the nation entered the war, that label became a mission statement. Automobile plants refitted their production lines to build tanks and aircraft. Typewriter and appliance factories produced radio sets and munitions. Shipyards turned out 5,000-ton cargo vessels with an astonishing tempo. Women, the Rosies of cultural memory, poured into factories and weld shops. They learned to rivet, to operate forging presses, and to run assembly lines. The slogan, "We can do it," was more than a poster. It became a social imperative. Production statistics read like a new industrial gospel. Thousands of aircraft were produced each month, thousands of tanks rolled off assembly lines, and the famous Liberty ships, built to move troops and supplies across oceanic convoys, were launched by the hundreds. The industrial surge was not simply about output, it was a transformation of labor, technology, and social roles. For the first time in large numbers, women, African Americans, and immigrants entered industries that had once been closed to them. That inclusion came with limits and tensions. Workplace segregation, unequal pay, and racial injustice persisted, but the war's demands began to fracture old labor patterns. Logistics, not just battlefield tactics, determined victory. The United States supplied food, fuel, steel, and machines to allies around the globe. Convoys crossed the Atlantic under the threat of U-boat attack. Shipyards and dock workers labored day and night to keep supply lines open. In the Pacific, amphibious equipment and naval escorts moved island by island. Across the Atlantic, supplies sustained Britain and later freed European fronts. The American economy became the engine that powered a coalition. Industrial capacity merged with scientific ingenuity. U.S. universities, private laboratories, and military research centers became central players in wartime innovation. One of the most consequential programs was the Manhattan Project, a top-secret effort launched in the heart of the war to build an atomic bomb. It brought together brilliant physicists and engineers who, in laboratories hidden in remote places like Los Alamos, New Mexico, worked around the clock. Decades later, ethics and consequences of that project remain subjects of intense debate, but at the time, the Manhattan Project reflected a wartime national belief in deploying all intellectual and material resources to end the conflict as quickly as possible. Other advancements, radar, sonar, improved medicines including antibiotics, and advancements in communications and logistics also flowed from the marriage of government funding and private expertise. These innovations improved combat outcomes and reshaped post-war society. Mobilization was not only industrial, it was social. The draft lists, called millions of men to service. Training camps spread across the country turned recruits into soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. Women enlisted in auxiliary services and took on essential roles at home and overseas in nursing, clerical work, and support roles. Communities created war gardens, rationed commodities, and organized charity drives. Patriotic fervor fueled volunteerism at unprecedented scale. Civilians bore sacrifices. Rationing systems limited gasoline, sugar, and rubber. People clipped coupons and queued for canned goods. Yet for many Americans, the inconvenience was a small price for the goal of victory. The home front became an extension of the battlefield. The factory was as vital as the front line. The price of fear. Japanese internment. This period of national solidarity also included one of the darkest episodes in American domestic policy. Driven by wartime fear, racist prejudice, and perceived security needs, the government authorized the removal and internment of roughly 120,000 people of Japanese descent, most of them U.S. citizens, from the West Coast into camps in the interior. These men, women, and children lost homes, businesses, and liberties. Decades later, the U.S. government would formally apologize and provide reparations. At the time, internment was justified by many as a wartime necessity, though historians now view it as a grave civil liberties betrayal. American strategy had to be global. The United States fought a two-ocean war in Europe and in the Pacific. In Europe, the U.S. joined its British allies in a long campaign of attrition, from the air war over Germany to the amphibious invasions in North Africa and Italy, culminating in the cross-channel invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944. That invasion opened a Western front that relieved pressure on the Soviet Union and began the long march through France and into Germany. In the Pacific, the approach was island hopping, to seize strategic islands, establish airfields, and inch closer to the Japanese home islands. Battles like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Midway, and Iwo Jima were bloody and costly. They showed that amphibious warfare and carrier-based operations would be decisive in the Pacific theater. American naval and air power slowly but decisively reversed Japanese expansion. American industrial muscle made possible an unprecedented convergence. While U.S. soldiers, airmen, and sailors fought overseas, factories at home produced the armor, planes, ships, and supplies those forces needed to press forward. The integration of production and strategy was perhaps the war's most defining American contribution. The cultural mobilization. Movies, radio, and print journalists framed the war for mass audiences. Newsreels shown before films brought battle images into cinemas. Radio broadcasts kept families informed of casualty lists, ship sinkings, and battlefield advances. Films encouraged enlistment and bond sales. Public schools promoted civics and patriotism. This steady stream of information, interpretation, and storytelling shaped popular understanding and buttressed collective resolve. Victory did not come cheaply. The final years of the war demanded staggering effort and inflicted terrible losses. When victory in Europe came on May 8, 1945, VE Day, the nation celebrated but still faced the Pacific War. The closing chapter came after the United States used atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Japan announced surrender on August 15, 1945, and the formal surrender took place in September. The combined human and moral cost of those decisions shadowed triumphant headlines. After the fighting ended, the country faced the immense task of reconversion, moving from wartime production to peacetime goods, reintegrating veterans into civilian life, and healing national wounds, including the injustice of Japanese internment. The GI Bill, passed in June of 1944 and implemented in the post-war years, offered returning veterans new educational and housing opportunities and played a central role in shaping post-war prosperity. By the war's end, the United States had emerged as a global leader, militarily unmatched and economically ascendant. The institutions, alliances, and international architecture that followed, the United Nations, the Marshall Plan, and NATO, grew from wartime cooperation and American willingness to underwrite reconstruction. The United States took on a role that was not merely military and economic, but political and moral, for better or worse, seeking to shape a post-war order that would prevent future large-scale wars. Viewed from an American perspective, the country's entry into World War II was a story of sudden moral clarity and industrial metamorphosis. Isolationism gave way to engagement when the nation was attacked. The war's American chapter was distinctive for its scale of production, its scientific mobilization, and the social changes it forced. It also exposed fault lines, racial injustice, and civil liberties violations that later generations had to confront. The war was a crucible. It remade industry, redefined social roles, and repositioned the United States in a world no longer dominated by European powers alone. For many Americans, the war reaffirmed a belief in national purpose and collective action. For others, it left complicated legacies of sacrifice and moral compromise. In the final tally, the period from the shock of December 7, 1941, through the summer of 1945 stands as a defining moment in American history, an era when a nation reinvented itself under fire and in doing so helped to remake the 20th century.